June 15, 1944, 8 miles inland from Omaha Beach, Normandy. The morning mist hung low over the hedgerows as Sergeant First Class Thomas Washington knelt behind a crumbling stone wall, his weathered hands clasped together in quiet prayer. Around him the men of 2nd Squad, 325th Infantry Regiment, cleaned their rifles and shared rations, their voices carrying the easy confidence of soldiers who believed their biggest challenge would be keeping up with the rapid advance toward Paris. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them could have imagined was that within hours, this 32-year-old man from rural Alabama would become the difference between their squad returning home or disappearing forever into the Norman countryside. The 325th Infantry Regiment was part of the 82nd Airborne Division's follow-up forces, tasked with consolidating the gains made by the initial paratrooper drops. Unlike the more celebrated all-white units that dominated newspaper headlines back home, the 325th operated in the shadows of segregation, their achievements systematically overlooked by military correspondents who preferred stories that fit America's preferred narrative of the conflict. The regiment consisted of 1,200 African-American soldiers, led predominantly by white officers who ranged from genuinely supportive to openly hostile toward their men. Thomas Washington had been born in 1812 in Selma, Alabama, the son of a sharecropper who had taught him that dignity came not from what others thought of you, but from how you carried yourself when no one was watching. He had joined the Army in 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor, driven less by patriotism than by the simple economic reality that military service offered steady pay and 3 meals a day. What he had not expected was to discover within himself a natural gift for leadership and an almost supernatural ability to read terrain and anticipate enemy movements. The squad he led reflected the complex demographics of segregated military service. Private First Class Marcus Johnson, 19 years old from Detroit, had been a factory worker before the conflict, his hands still bearing the calluses from operating heavy machinery at the Ford River Rouge plant. His knowledge of mechanical systems made him invaluable for maintaining their equipment under field conditions. Corporal James Williams, 24, hailed from New Orleans and possessed an uncanny ability to navigate by stars and landmarks, a skill he had learned as a child hunting in the Louisiana bayous with his grandfather. Private Robert Davis, the youngest at 18, came from a farming family in Mississippi and could identify edible plants and predict weather changes with remarkable accuracy. Private First Class Samuel Brooks, 26, had been a school teacher in Chicago before the conflict and served as the squad's unofficial medic. Though his training consisted mainly of first aid courses and whatever knowledge he could glean from borrowed medical texts. Private Charles Thompson, 22, from Philadelphia, had worked as a radio operator for a civilian broadcasting station and handled their communications equipment with professional competence. Private Joseph Martinez, 21, represented one of the few exceptions to the regiment's racial composition, a Mexican-American from Texas who had been assigned to the unit due to administrative confusion and had remained because no one wanted to deal with the paperwork of transferring him. Private David Anderson, 23, from Boston, had attended 2 years of college before financial constraints forced him to enlist, and his education made him useful for translation when they encountered French civilians. Finally, Private Henry Clark, 25, from rural Georgia, possessed an almost mystical ability to move silently through any terrain, a talent that had made him the squad's primary scout. The morning of June 15th found them occupying positions near the village of Virville-sur-Mer, approximately 8 miles southeast of their initial landing zones. Their mission was straightforward in concept, but complex in execution. Advance through the Bocage country, the dense network of fields surrounded by ancient earthen banks, topped with thick hedgerows that had defined Norman agriculture for centuries, and establish observation posts that could guide artillery fire against German positions further inland. The Bocage presented unique tactical challenges that American forces had not fully anticipated during their planning phases. Each field was essentially a natural fortress, surrounded by earthen embankments that rose 6 to 8 feet high and were topped with centuries-old hedgerows so thick that visibility between fields rarely exceeded 50 yards. The narrow lanes that connected these fields created perfect killing grounds for defensive forces, while the limited sight lines made it nearly impossible for attacking units to coordinate their movements or call for effective artillery support. German forces had recognized the defensive potential of this terrain and had spent months preparing positions that took maximum advantage of its characteristics. Machine gun nests were carefully sited to cover the gaps between hedgerows, while mortar teams positioned themselves in covered locations where they could rain fire down on any advancing troops without exposing themselves to counterattack. Snipers occupied concealed positions in farmhouses and church towers, picking off American soldiers who exposed themselves for even brief moments. The 325th Regiment had been advancing through this terrain for 9 days since the initial landings, moving slowly but steadily against increasingly organized resistance. Their progress was measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles, each field requiring careful reconnaissance and coordinated assault to clear German defenders. The psychological toll was beginning to show on many of the men who had expected rapid movement toward their objectives rather than this grinding, methodical advance through seemingly endless agricultural obstacles. Washington's squad had been assigned a particularly challenging sector, a series of 4 connected fields that German reconnaissance had identified as a potential assembly area for American artillery. Intelligence reports suggested the area was lightly defended, possibly by a single machine gun team and a few riflemen. The plan called for 2nd Squad to advance through the first field at 0800 hours, establish overwatch positions, and signal for the rest of the platoon to follow once the area was confirmed secure. As the men prepared for the advance, Washington knelt for his morning prayer, a ritual he had maintained since basic training, regardless of circumstances or the reactions of those around him. His faith had been shaped by years of attending the Mount Olive Baptist Church in Selma, where Reverend Samuel Jackson had taught that prayer was not about asking God to change the world, but about asking for the strength and wisdom to face whatever challenges the world might present. Private Johnson watched his sergeant's morning ritual with poorly concealed amusement. "Sarge, you really think the Lord's got time to worry about one squad of soldiers when there's thousands of guys fighting all across France?" he asked, his Detroit accent carrying the skeptical tone of someone who had seen too much urban poverty to maintain simple faith. "Maybe he thinks his prayers are going to stop German bullets," added Private Clark with a soft Georgia drawl, his comment drawing quiet laughter from several of the other men. Clark's own relationship with religion had been complicated by years of watching supposedly devout white Christians participate in the lynching and oppression that had defined his childhood in rural Georgia. Washington finished his prayer and looked up at his men without anger or defensiveness. "I don't pray to stop bullets," he said quietly. "I pray for the wisdom to know where they're coming from and the courage to do what needs doing when they start flying." The casual mockery of his faith was nothing new to Washington. He had endured similar comments throughout basic training and their months of preparation in England. Some of the men seemed to view his religious devotion as a weakness, a reliance on supernatural intervention rather than practical military skills. Others, particularly those from urban backgrounds, saw organized religion as part of the same system that had kept African Americans in subordinate positions throughout American society. Washington understood their skepticism, but his own experience had taught him that faith and practical military competence were not contradictory forces. His ability to remain calm under pressure, to make sound tactical decisions when exhaustion and fear clouded other men's judgment, to maintain hope when situations appeared hopeless. These qualities had been strengthened rather than weakened by his spiritual beliefs. At 0745 hours, the squad received final confirmation of their mission parameters through their radio operator. The regimental commander had emphasized the importance of speed in securing their objectives, as aerial reconnaissance had detected increased German vehicle movement in the area over the previous 24 hours. Higher command suspected that enemy forces were repositioning to establish stronger defensive lines further inland, making it crucial for American units to advance quickly enough to disrupt these preparations. The first field they needed to cross appeared deceptively peaceful in the morning light. Approximately 150 yards wide and 200 yards long, it contained the remnants of what had been a wheat crop before the conflict had disrupted normal agricultural activities. The wheat had grown wild and unmanaged, creating patches of cover that could conceal both advancing soldiers and defensive positions. The field was bordered on three sides by the typical Norman hedgerows, with a gap in the far northeastern corner that provided access to the next field in their sequence. Washington studied the terrain through his field glasses, paying particular attention to the hedgerows that would provide concealment for any German defenders. The morning breeze was light and variable, making it difficult to predict how sound would carry across the field. Cloud cover was approximately 60%, providing intermittent concealment from aerial observation, but not enough to significantly impact ground visibility. "Johnson, you and Martinez take the left flank," Washington directed, pointing toward the western edge of the field. "Stay low and move in bounds. Williams, you and Brooks follow the center line but offset about 20 yards to the right. Clark and Anderson, you're with me on the right flank. Thompson, you stay here with the radio and maintain contact with platoon headquarters. Davis, you provide overwatch from this position until we reach the halfway point, then follow with Thompson." The tactical formation Washington had chosen represented a compromise between speed and security. By spreading his men across the width of the field, he reduced the likelihood that a single German machine gun could engage his entire squad simultaneously. The staggered movement pattern meant that even if one team encountered resistance, the others would be positioned to provide supporting fire or maneuver around the threat. At precisely 0800 hours, Washington signaled the advance. The squad moved out in their assigned formations, each man carrying approximately 40 pounds of equipment, including ammunition, rations, and personal gear. The early morning air was cool and humid, typical for Norman coastal regions in mid-June, and the ground beneath their feet was soft from recent rain, but not muddy enough to impede movement significantly. For the first 75 yards, the advance proceeded exactly as planned. The men moved carefully but steadily, using the available cover and maintaining proper intervals between team members. Thompson's radio remained silent, indicating that other elements of the platoon were proceeding according to schedule. The only sounds were the distant rumble of artillery fire from sectors to the north, and the normal rural sounds of birds and insects that suggested no immediate human threat. Washington had nearly reached the center of the field when his years of combat experience triggered an almost subconscious alarm. Something about the silence from the hedgerows ahead felt wrong. Birds that had been singing moments earlier had suddenly gone quiet, and the morning breeze carried a faint metallic smell that might have been gun oil or recently fired ammunition. He raised his closed fist, signaling for the squad to halt and take cover. The German ambush that erupted 30 seconds later was a masterpiece of tactical timing and positioning. Machine gun fire opened from 3 concealed positions simultaneously, one in the hedgerow directly ahead of Washington's position, and 2 others positioned to create a crossfire that covered the entire width of the field. The sound of the MG-42s was distinctive and terrifying, a rapid-fire bark that could deliver up to 1,500 rounds per minute with devastating accuracy. Within moments, the air above the wheat field was filled with the supersonic crack of bullets passing overhead, and the deeper whine of ricochets from stones and metal objects scattered throughout the field. Washington's squad found themselves pinned down in whatever cover they could find: shallow depressions in the ground, occasional larger rocks, and the sparse concealment offered by the overgrown wheat. "Contact front!" Thompson shouted into his radio handset, following standard procedures for reporting enemy engagement. "Second squad taking fire from multiple positions, requesting immediate artillery support." But even as he spoke, the crackle of static from his radio indicated that something was interfering with their communications, either atmospheric conditions or deliberate German jamming efforts. The tactical situation had deteriorated from routine advance to life-threatening crisis in less than 60 seconds. Washington's mind automatically shifted into the analytical mode that had kept him alive through previous engagements. The machine gun positions were expertly sited to create overlapping fields of fire that made movement in any direction extremely hazardous. The nearest cover that could provide genuine protection was the hedgerow they had left behind, approximately 75 yards to their rear. Private Johnson, caught in the open near the left edge of the field, was pinned behind a depression that provided concealment but no real protection from the machine gun fire that periodically swept over his position. "Sarge," he called out, his voice tight with controlled fear, "I can't move from here. Every time I try to shift position, they put fire right over my head." Similar calls came from other members of the squad, each man trapped in whatever minimal cover he had found when the firing began. The German machine gunners demonstrated professional competence, firing short bursts designed to conserve ammunition while maintaining suppressive fire that prevented any American movement. Occasionally, they would shift their fire to different areas of the field, creating the impression that they were responding to movement, whether or not any actually occurred. Washington realized that their situation was far worse than a simple ambush. The German positions had been prepared specifically for this type of engagement, with interlocking fields of fire that indicated detailed knowledge of American tactical procedures. This was not a chance encounter with a patrol or outpost, but a deliberate trap designed to eliminate American forces attempting to advance through this particular route. More alarming was the gradual realization that the machine gun fire was not the full extent of the German presence in the area. Washington could hear the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds, indicating that the enemy had observers who could direct indirect fire onto their positions. The first mortar rounds impacted approximately 50 yards behind their current positions, but the subsequent rounds walked steadily closer as the German observers adjusted their fire. "We need to move," Williams called out from his position in the center of the field. "They're getting our range with those mortars." His observation was confirmed moments later when a mortar round exploded less than 20 yards from Thompson's radio position, sending dirt and metal fragments flying through the air. Washington assessed their options with the cold calculation that combat experience had taught him. Attempting to retreat across open ground would expose his men to concentrated machine gun fire that would likely result in multiple casualties. Advancing toward the German positions was equally suicidal, as they would be moving into increasingly heavy fire from prepared positions. Remaining in place meant accepting a slow but certain elimination by mortar fire as the German observers refined their targeting. It was at this moment of tactical desperation that Washington made a decision that would have seemed incomprehensible to military textbooks, but made perfect sense to a man whose faith had sustained him through decades of adversity. He closed his eyes and began to pray, not for divine intervention or supernatural protection, but for the clarity of thought and strength of purpose that he had learned came from surrendering his fears to a power greater than himself. "Our Father, who art in heaven," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of gunfire and explosions. "Give me the wisdom to see what others cannot see, and the courage to act when action seems impossible." As he prayed, his mind became calm and focused, allowing him to notice details that fear and adrenaline had previously obscured. The pattern of machine gun fire was not random, he realized. The German gunners were following a systematic sequence that covered the field in overlapping arcs. But there were brief gaps in their coverage as they shifted between targets. More importantly, the sound of the gunfire was creating echoes from the hedgerows that might mask the sound of movement if timed correctly. The mortar fire was also following a predictable pattern, with approximately 45 seconds between rounds, as the operators adjusted their aim and reloaded. "Listen to me." Washington called out to his squad, his voice carrying the calm authority that had made them trust his leadership in previous engagements. "The machine guns are firing in a pattern. There's a 3-second gap every 20 seconds when they shift targets. When I give the signal, everyone moves to their right exactly 10 yards and hits the dirt. Don't think about it, just do it." The idea of coordinated movement under machine gun fire seemed like suicide to several of the squad members. "Sarge, that's crazy," Johnson protested. "Those guns will cut us down the second we move." "Trust me," Washington replied, his eyes still closed in prayer. "I can hear the pattern. When I say move, you move. When I say stop, you hit the ground hard. Don't hesitate, don't think. Just follow my voice." For 30 seconds, that seemed like hours, Washington listened to the rhythm of the German fire, timing the intervals between bursts and identifying the brief moments when their fields of fire shifted. Then, with absolute confidence in his timing, he gave the command, "Move!" The entire squad rolled and crawled to their right, covering approximately 10 yards in the 3 seconds of relative quiet that Washington had identified. As they hit the ground, machine gun fire resumed exactly where they had been moments before, proving that his analysis of the firing pattern had been accurate. "Again!" Washington commanded after waiting for the next cycle. "Move!" A second coordinated displacement put the squad in a position where they were partially concealed by a slight rise in the ground that had not been visible from their original positions. More importantly, they were now positioned at an angle that allowed Washington to see the muzzle flashes from 2 of the 3 machine gun positions. But the German mortar fire was adapting to their movement, and Washington realized that they had perhaps 2 more minutes before the indirect fire became accurate enough to eliminate them regardless of their positioning. It was then that his prayer revealed an insight that would save not only his squad, but potentially dozens of other American soldiers in the days to come. The machine gun positions, he realized, were not located in the hedgerows themselves, but in carefully prepared bunkers built into the earthen embankments that supported the hedgerows. This meant that while the guns could fire across the field, the gunners themselves were protected from return fire by several feet of packed earth and stone. However, the construction of these bunkers required air vents and ammunition storage areas that would be vulnerable to a different type of attack. "Brooks," Washington called to his squad medic, "you still got those white phosphorus grenades?" "2 of them, Sarge," Brooks replied, referring to the incendiary grenades that were officially intended for creating smoke screens, but could also be used to force enemy troops out of fortified positions. "Williams, can you see that dead tree about 30 yards to our right? The one with the broken branches?" Williams studied the terrain in the direction Washington indicated. "Yeah, I see it. That tree is growing right on top of the embankment, where one of those machine guns is positioned. If we can get a phosphorus grenade into the root system, the smoke and fire will get drawn down into their bunker through the ventilation system." The plan Washington was proposing required precise timing and coordination under fire, but it offered their only realistic chance of breaking the German ambush. Brooks would need to move approximately 20 yards to get within throwing range of the target, while the rest of the squad provided covering fire to suppress the German positions. "On my count, everyone puts fire on the hedgerows," Washington instructed. "Don't worry about hitting anything. Just make noise and keep their heads down. Brooks, you move when the fire starts and get that grenade as close to the base of that tree as possible." Washington's prayer had revealed not just the tactical solution to their immediate problem, but also the confidence and clarity needed to execute a complex plan under extreme pressure. As he gave the final countdown, his voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who had surrendered his fears and trusted in something greater than himself. 3, 2, 1, fire. The squad's concentrated rifle fire erupted toward the German positions, the individual shots merging into a sustained crackling that filled the air with the sound of combat. Brooks sprinted from his concealed position, covering the 20 yards to his throwing position in less than 10 seconds, while bullets kicked up dirt around his feet. His first phosphorus grenade landed within 5 feet of the target tree, immediately beginning to burn with the characteristic white smoke that marked this type of incendiary device. Within 30 seconds, the smoke was being drawn downward into the German bunker system, and the machine gun fire from that position became sporadic and then stopped entirely. "It's working," Williams shouted. "They're evacuating that position." But the success against one machine gun position had alerted the other German defenders to the American tactics, and the remaining 2 machine guns increased their rate of fire to compensate for the loss of their comrade. Washington realized that they needed to press their advantage quickly before the Germans could adapt to the new situation. "Clark, Anderson," he called to his remaining team members, "can you work your way around to the left and get an angle on that second machine gun position?" Clark's experience moving silently through Georgia swampland had prepared him for exactly this type of tactical challenge. "Give me 5 minutes and keep them busy," he replied, already beginning to crawl toward a position that would allow him to approach the German bunker from an unexpected direction. While Clark maneuvered for position, Washington continued his tactical prayer, asking not for miraculous intervention, but for the continued clarity of thought that had already saved his squad from elimination. His faith provided a foundation of calm that allowed him to process information and make decisions without being overwhelmed by the chaos and violence of the situation. The sound of small arms fire from their left indicated that Clark had reached his objective and was engaging the second machine gun position with his rifle. While one man with a rifle could not eliminate a fortified position, his fire would force the German gunners to divide their attention and reduce the accuracy of their suppressive fire against the rest of the squad. "Now," Washington commanded, "everyone advance 20 yards and take cover. Move fast and stay low." The squad's second coordinated movement brought them to within 50 yards of the remaining German positions and allowed Washington to identify the exact location of the third machine gun bunker. More importantly, they were now close enough for their rifle fire to be genuinely threatening to any German soldier who exposed himself, forcing the enemy to remain in covered positions rather than maneuvering to better firing positions. The tactical balance of the engagement was shifting in favor of the Americans, but Washington recognized that their advantage would be temporary unless they could eliminate the remaining German positions quickly. The sound of vehicle engines in the distance suggested that German reinforcements might be responding to the firefight, which would once again tip the odds against his isolated squad. It was Private Martinez who provided the key to resolving the situation. His mechanical knowledge, gained from years working in automotive repair shops in Texas, allowed him to recognize that the sound of the remaining German machine guns had changed subtly over the course of the engagement. "Sarge," he called out, "that gun on the right is starting to overheat. Listen to how the rate of fire is slowing down." Washington listened carefully and confirmed Martinez's observation. The sustained firing required to pin down his squad had pushed the German machine gun beyond its optimal operating temperature, causing the rate of fire to decrease and potentially leading to mechanical jamming if the gun continued to fire without cooling time. "When that gun jams, we rush the position," Washington decided. "Everyone be ready to move on my command. We'll have maybe 30 seconds before they get it back in operation." The mechanical failure Washington was waiting for occurred less than 2 minutes later, when the overheated machine gun stopped firing entirely. "Go, go, go!" he shouted, leading his squad in a coordinated rush toward the German bunker. The assault across the final 50 yards of open ground required every ounce of courage and determination that Washington's men could summon. German rifle fire erupted from secondary positions as they advanced, and the sound of the jammed machine gun being cleared warned that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. But the momentum of their charge, combined with the suppressive fire from Clark's flanking position, carried them to the German bunker before the defenders could re-establish effective resistance. Private Brooks, still carrying his second phosphorus grenade, dropped it through the ventilation opening of the bunker, forcing the German soldiers inside to evacuate their position or be overcome by smoke and fire. 3 German soldiers emerged from the bunker, with their hands raised, their faces blackened by smoke and their uniforms singed by phosphorus burns. They were young men, probably no older than 20, and their expressions showed the shock and exhaustion of soldiers who had been overwhelmed by tactics they had not anticipated. Washington's squad had eliminated a carefully prepared German defensive position that had been designed to stop American advances through this sector of the bocage. More importantly, they had done so without losing a single man, a result that would have seemed impossible when they first found themselves pinned down by the coordinated ambush. Faz Thompson re-established radio contact with platoon headquarters and reported their success. Washington gathered his men for a brief assessment of their situation. The immediate tactical victory had been achieved, but they were still deep in contested territory, with German reinforcements potentially approaching their position. "That was incredible, Sarge," Johnson said, his earlier skepticism about Washington's prayer ritual replaced by genuine admiration. "How did you know that pattern in their machine gun fire would give us those gaps to move?" Washington looked at his squad, 9 men who had trusted his leadership even when his plan seemed suicidal, who had followed his commands without hesitation when hesitation would have meant death. His answer was quiet, but carried the conviction of a man whose faith had been tested and proven in the crucible of combat. "I listened," he said simply. "When you stop being afraid and start trusting, you can hear things that fear keeps hidden." The captured German soldiers provided valuable intelligence about enemy defensive preparations in the area. Under questioning by regimental intelligence officers, they revealed that the bunker system Washington's squad had eliminated was part of a larger network designed to channel American advances into predetermined killing zones. The tactical innovations that Washington had developed during the engagement, particularly the use of phosphorus grenades against bunker ventilation systems, were immediately shared with other units facing similar defensive positions. But the impact of Washington's leadership extended far beyond tactical innovations or captured intelligence. Word of how 2nd Squad had overcome impossible odds through faith, teamwork, and tactical brilliance spread rapidly through the 325th Infantry Regiment. Soldiers who had previously viewed religious faith as weakness or superstition began to see it as a source of strength that could complement rather than replace military competence. The transformation was particularly notable among the urban soldiers who had initially been most skeptical of Washington's prayer routine. Private Johnson, whose Detroit background had made him suspicious of organized religion, began asking Washington about the source of the calm confidence that had enabled him to think clearly under extreme pressure. "It's not about asking God to change the situation," Washington explained during one of their evening conversations. "It's about asking for the strength and wisdom to face whatever situation you find yourself in. Fear makes you stupid, but faith makes you calm. And when you're calm, you can see solutions that panic hides." The psychological impact of their victory extended beyond Washington's immediate squad to influence the entire regiment's approach to combat in the Bocage country. Units that had previously approached each field with dread and expectation of heavy casualties began to view the challenging terrain as a series of tactical problems that could be solved through careful observation, coordinated teamwork, and innovative thinking. Washington's methods were studied and adapted by other squad leaders throughout the regiment. His emphasis on listening to environmental sounds, timing enemy fire patterns, and using unconventional tactics against fortified positions became standard components of training for new replacements. More subtly, his demonstration that religious faith could coexist with aggressive military action helped to resolve a psychological conflict that had troubled many African American soldiers. The segregated nature of American military service had created a complex relationship between faith and military duty for many black soldiers. Traditional Christian teachings about turning the other cheek and loving one's enemies seemed to conflict with the demands of combat, while the racism they experienced from white officers and fellow soldiers made it difficult to feel that they were fighting for a truly righteous cause. Washington's example demonstrated that faith could provide strength for military action rather than undermining it, and that religious devotion could make a soldier more effective rather than less capable. His squad's success proved that divine guidance and tactical competence were complementary rather than contradictory forces. The weeks following their initial engagement saw 2nd Squad participate in a series of successful operations that established them as one of the most effective small units in the 325th Regiment. Their reputation for accomplishing difficult missions without casualties attracted the attention of higher command levels, leading to assignments that carried both greater responsibility and greater danger. On July 2nd, Washington's squad was tasked with conducting a reconnaissance mission behind German lines to identify artillery positions that had been disrupting American supply convoys. The mission required them to penetrate approximately 3 miles into enemy territory, gather detailed intelligence on German gun positions, and return without alerting German forces to their presence. The squad departed their forward positions at 0200 hours, moving through terrain that had been contested by both sides for weeks. The constant fighting had transformed the Norman countryside into a landscape of shell craters, abandoned equipment, and improvised fortifications that required careful navigation to avoid detection. Washington led the patrol using a combination of celestial navigation and landmark recognition that reflected both his Alabama rural background and his growing confidence in divine guidance. His morning prayer before departure had included a request for protection during their mission, but also for the wisdom to recognize important intelligence when they encountered it. The German artillery positions they discovered exceeded the scope of their original mission objectives. Hidden in a wooded area that provided concealment from aerial observation were 650mm howitzers capable of delivering highly accurate fire against American positions up to 15 miles away. More significantly, Washington observed German crews practicing rapid displacement techniques that would allow them to fire several rounds and then move to alternate positions before American counter-battery fire could locate them. But it was during their observation of the German artillery that Washington noticed something that would prove far more valuable than intelligence about gun positions. The German crews were following a rigid schedule of activities that suggested they were receiving their fire missions through a centralized command system rather than responding to immediate battlefield developments. By carefully timing the German activities, Washington determined that fire missions were being transmitted at specific intervals that corresponded to scheduled radio broadcasts from higher command levels. This suggested that disrupting German communications at the right times could significantly reduce the effectiveness of their artillery support for defensive operations. The intelligence Washington's squad gathered during their reconnaissance mission led to a coordinated American operation that eliminated the German artillery positions and captured the radio equipment used to coordinate their fire missions. The operation prevented what German documents later revealed would have been a major counterattack designed to push American forces back to the beaches. But perhaps more significantly, Washington's continued success in completing impossible missions was beginning to attract attention from war correspondents who were looking for positive stories about African American military service. The institutional racism of the American military had largely prevented black soldiers from receiving recognition for their achievements, but Washington's reputation was becoming too remarkable to ignore entirely. On July 15th, exactly 1 month after their first major engagement, Washington's squad was visited by Captain Robert Hayes, a white officer from the regiment's public affairs section, who was accompanied by a war correspondent from Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper. The correspondent, Staff Sergeant William Morrison, had been tasked with writing a series of articles about the contributions of African American soldiers to the European campaign. His previous interviews had focused on support units and rear area activities, but Washington's combat record had attracted attention at division level as an example of black soldiers performing effectively in frontline roles. "Sergeant Washington," Morrison began, setting up his notebook to record the interview, "I understand that your squad has achieved an unusual record of success in some very difficult operations. Can you tell me what you think accounts for your effectiveness in combat?" Washington's response reflected both his natural humility and his understanding that his answer would be read by thousands of soldiers and civilians throughout the American military system. "Every man in this squad knows his job and does it well," he replied. "We look out for each other. We listen to what the terrain and the enemy are telling us, and we trust that we'll find a way through whatever situation we face." "I've heard that you pray before missions," Morrison continued. "Do you think that contributes to your success?" "I pray for wisdom and courage," Washington answered carefully. "Combat requires clear thinking and the ability to act when action is necessary. My faith helps me stay calm so I can think clearly and make good decisions for my men." Morrison's article, published in the August 1st edition of Stars and Stripes under the headline, "Faith and Fighting, Alabama Sergeant Leads Squad Through Normandy," was one of the first widely circulated stories to present an African-American soldier as a tactical innovator and combat leader, rather than simply as a support worker or victim of discrimination. The article's impact extended far beyond its immediate readership. Copies were reprinted in African-American newspapers throughout the United States, providing communities that had been largely excluded from positive war news with evidence that black soldiers were making significant contributions to the military effort overseas. More importantly for Washington and his men, the article's positive reception led to changes in how the 325th Regiment was employed by higher command levels. Instead of being relegated to support roles or diversionary missions, the regiment began receiving assignments that recognized their combat effectiveness and allowed them to participate fully in major operations. Washington's squad played a crucial role in the breakout from the Normandy beachhead during Operation Cobra in late July. Their ability to infiltrate German positions and provide accurate intelligence about enemy defensive preparations helped American forces identify weak points in the German lines that could be exploited by armored spearheads. But it was during the pursuit of German forces toward the Seine River in August that Washington faced his greatest test as both a military leader and a man of faith. On August 12th, his squad was attached to a tank unit that had been tasked with securing a bridge over the Seine before German forces could destroy it and delay the American advance. The mission proceeded smoothly until the American column encountered a group of approximately 50 German prisoners being escorted to the rear by a single American guard who had been wounded and was barely capable of maintaining control over his charges. The guard, Corporal Michael O'Brien from Boston, explained that his unit had been ambushed while escorting the prisoners, leaving him as the sole survivor responsible for preventing their escape. The tactical situation presented Washington with a complex moral and practical dilemma. The German prisoners included several officers who possessed valuable intelligence about enemy defensive plans, making their delivery to interrogation centers a high priority. However, detaching enough men to properly guard 50 prisoners would leave his squad too small to accomplish their primary mission of securing the bridge. More troubling was the attitude of some American soldiers toward German prisoners, particularly SS troops, who were suspected of committing atrocities against American captives. Several tank crew members suggested that the easiest solution would be to shoot the prisoners and continue with the mission, arguing that proper escort would require resources that could not be spared. Washington's response drew upon both his military training and his religious convictions in ways that demonstrated the practical application of Christian principles under extreme circumstances. "We're going to escort these men according to the rules of war," he announced firmly. "Our job is to defeat the German army, not to become the kind of people we're fighting against." The decision to maintain proper treatment of prisoners, despite tactical inconvenience, required Washington to develop a solution that satisfied both military necessity and moral obligation. He detailed 2 of his men to assist Corporal O'Brien with prisoner escort, while the remainder of the squad continued toward their bridge objective with the tank unit. But the moral test that situation presented was only the beginning of the challenges Washington would face over the following days. As American forces advanced rapidly through France, they began encountering evidence of German atrocities against French civilians and captured Allied soldiers that tested the faith and discipline of even the most committed soldiers. On August 15th, Washington's squad discovered a farmhouse where German troops had executed a French family for allegedly providing information to American forces. The scene included 3 children, the youngest approximately 6 years old, who had been shot while attempting to hide in the house's cellar. The discovery of murdered children produced a rage among Washington's men that threatened to overwhelm their military discipline and Christian principles. Several squad members demanded immediate retaliation against the German prisoners they had captured earlier, arguing that soldiers capable of murdering children deserved no protection under the laws of war. Washington's response to this crisis revealed the depth of his faith and the practical strength it provided under the most challenging circumstances. Rather than attempting to suppress his men's anger or dismiss their moral outrage, he acknowledged the legitimacy of their feelings while maintaining the standards that defined them as soldiers and human beings. "What we found here is evil," he said as the squad gathered around the farmhouse. "Those children deserve to live and grow up and have families of their own. The men who did this will answer to God for what they've done, and that judgment will be more complete and more just than anything we could accomplish here. But we're not going to become like them," he continued. "We're going to stay who we are, American soldiers who fight to protect innocent people, not to hurt them. The moment we start acting like them, we stop being the good guys in this war." Washington's moral leadership during this crisis established a standard of conduct that influenced not only his immediate squad, but other units in the regiment who heard about his response to discovering German atrocities. His demonstration that faith could provide strength for maintaining ethical standards under extreme pressure helped to resolve conflicts between religious conviction and military duty that had troubled many soldiers. The practical results of Washington's moral leadership extended beyond maintaining discipline within his own unit. His insistence on proper treatment of prisoners led to intelligence gathering that proved crucial to American tactical success during the final phases of the Normandy campaign. The German officers his squad had captured and protected provided detailed information about enemy withdrawal plans that allowed American forces to anticipate and disrupt German defensive preparations. This intelligence contributed to the capture of thousands of additional German soldiers who might otherwise have escaped to establish new defensive lines closer to the German border. Washington's reputation for both tactical competence and moral integrity led to his promotion to Staff Sergeant in late August, making him one of the highest-ranking African-American non-commissioned officers in the European theater. More significantly, his methods of leadership and tactical innovation were incorporated into training programs for other non-commissioned officers throughout the Army. But perhaps the most important impact of Washington's service was the transformation it produced in the men who served under his leadership. Soldiers who had begun the war with little confidence in their own abilities or the possibility of fair treatment within the military system developed into effective combat veterans who understood their own worth and potential. Private Johnson, who had initially mocked Washington's prayer routine, became one of the most vocal advocates for the integration of American military forces. His letters home to Detroit described how serving under Washington had changed his understanding of both military service and religious faith, providing examples that contradicted racist assumptions about African American capabilities. Sergeant Washington showed us that being a good Christian doesn't make you weak, Johnson wrote to his family. It makes you stronger, because you're not afraid of anything that can happen to you. When you trust in something bigger than yourself, you can do things that seem impossible. Similar transformations occurred throughout the squad as soldiers discovered that Washington's example had given them tools for dealing with fear, uncertainty, and moral complexity that extended far beyond military applications. His integration of faith and practical action provided a model for approaching life's challenges that many of them would carry forward long after the conflict ended. The broader impact of Washington's service extended to changing perceptions of African American military capabilities among white officers and soldiers who worked with his regiment. His consistent success in accomplishing difficult missions forced even racist individuals to acknowledge that black soldiers could perform effectively in combat roles when given proper leadership and equipment. Colonel James Patterson, the regimental commander who had initially been skeptical about the combat potential of African American troops, became one of Washington's strongest advocates within the military hierarchy. His reports to higher command levels emphasized the tactical innovations and leadership qualities that Washington had demonstrated, contributing to policy changes that expanded combat roles for black soldiers. Sergeant Washington represents the best of American military tradition, Patterson wrote in his final evaluation of Washington's service. His combination of tactical competence, moral courage, and inspirational leadership would be remarkable in any soldier regardless of race. His example demonstrates that character and ability are not determined by skin color, but by individual commitment to excellence and service. The recognition Washington received for his military service, while gratifying, was less important to him than the knowledge that his example had helped other soldiers discover their own potential for courage and leadership. His letters home to Alabama frequently mentioned the pride he felt in watching young men develop confidence and competence under his guidance. "The Lord put me in a position where I could help these boys become the men they were meant to be," he wrote to his wife in September 1944. "Some of them came here thinking they weren't good enough or smart enough to be real soldiers. Now they know better, and that knowledge will help them for the rest of their lives." Washington's squad participated in the liberation of Paris in August 1944, an experience that provided a powerful contrast to the segregation and discrimination they had experienced in their home country. French civilians who had endured 4 years of German occupation welcomed American soldiers as liberators, regardless of their race, providing Washington's men with their first experience of being treated as heroes rather than second-class citizens. The psychological impact of this reception was profound for soldiers who had grown up under Jim Crow laws and military segregation. For many of them, marching through Paris as conquering heroes represented the first time in their lives that they had been publicly honored for their achievements rather than marginalized because of their race. "I never thought I would see the day when white people would cheer for me and want to shake my hand," Private Davis wrote in his diary. "These French folks don't care what color we are. They just know we helped set them free. It makes me think about what America could be like if people judged soldiers by what they do instead of what they look like." But the celebration of liberation was tempered by the knowledge that the conflict was far from over. German forces had retreated in good order and were establishing new defensive lines along the German border that would require months of additional fighting to overcome. Washington's squad would continue to play a crucial role in operations that pushed German forces back to their homeland. The autumn of 1944 brought new challenges as American forces encountered increasingly desperate German resistance near the borders of Germany itself. Washington's squad participated in operations along the Siegfried Line, the complex system of fortifications that Germany had constructed along its western border during the 1930s. Fighting in this heavily fortified terrain required tactical innovations that built upon the lessons Washington had learned during the Bocage campaign. His techniques for identifying enemy positions through careful observation, coordinating small unit movements under fire, and maintaining morale under extreme stress became standard practice for other units facing similar challenges. But it was during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 that Washington faced his ultimate test as both a military leader and a man of faith. When German forces launched their surprise counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, Washington's regiment was among the units rushed north to contain the breakthrough and prevent German forces from reaching their objective of Antwerp. The battle began with Washington's squad cut off from the main American forces by German advances that had penetrated deep into previously secure areas. For 6 days, they survived behind enemy lines by using Washington's techniques of concealment and movement while gathering intelligence about German intentions and capabilities. During this period of isolation and constant danger, Washington's faith provided the psychological foundation that kept his squad functioning as an effective military unit rather than disintegrating under stress. His daily prayers became group activities that reinforced unit cohesion and maintained hope during circumstances that would have broken less committed soldiers. "Lord, give us the strength to endure whatever comes," Washington prayed each morning as German forces searched for their hidden positions. "Help us to remember that we're fighting for something bigger than ourselves, and give us the wisdom to know how we can best serve that cause." The intelligence Washington's squad gathered during their time behind German lines proved crucial to American understanding of German objectives during the Bulge offensive. Their observations of German supply movements and communications procedures provided warning of secondary attacks that might otherwise have achieved tactical surprise. When American forces finally re-established contact with Washington's squad, they found 9 soldiers who had not only survived 6 days of isolation in enemy territory, but had continued to function as an effective intelligence-gathering unit throughout their ordeal. Their example inspired other units and contributed to the eventual American victory in what became Germany's last major offensive of the war. Washington's service during the Battle of the Bulge led to his award of the Bronze Star for Valor, making him one of the first African-American soldiers to receive this decoration for combat action during World War II. More importantly, his example of leadership under extreme adversity influenced military policies regarding the integration of American forces. The success of Washington's integrated squad, which included soldiers of African-American, Mexican-American, and European-American backgrounds, provided evidence that racial integration could enhance rather than compromise military effectiveness. His methods of leadership that emphasized individual competence and mutual respect offered a model for how integrated units could function successfully. As the war in Europe entered its final phases during the spring of 1945, Washington's reputation as both a tactical innovator and moral leader had spread throughout the American military establishment. His techniques were being taught at non-commissioned officer schools, while his example of integrating faith with military service had influenced chaplain programs and soldier morale initiatives, but for Washington himself, the approaching end of the conflict raised questions about how the lessons he had learned and taught could be applied to the challenges that would face African American veterans returning to a segregated society. His letters home increasingly focused on the need to maintain the confidence and dignity that military service had provided to black soldiers. "These boys have learned that they can do anything they set their minds to," he wrote to his wife in March 1945. "They've proven themselves in the hardest test there is, and they're not going to be satisfied with being treated like second-class citizens when they get home. The war may be ending, but the fight for equality is just beginning." Washington's understanding of the broader implications of African American military service proved prophetic. The veterans who had served under his leadership became active participants in the civil rights movement that emerged in the decades following the war. Their military experience had provided them with organizational skills, leadership training, and, most importantly, the confidence that came from having proven themselves under the most challenging circumstances. Private Johnson returned to Detroit and became a labor organizer who fought for fair employment practices in the automotive industry. His military experience under Washington's leadership had taught him that effective organization and moral courage could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, lessons that proved invaluable in challenging discriminatory hiring practices. Corporal Williams used his military training to become a small business owner in New Orleans, eventually employing dozens of workers and becoming an influential voice in local civil rights organizations. His success demonstrated that the leadership skills African American soldiers had developed during the war could be applied effectively in civilian contexts. Private Brooks completed his education after the war and became a physician, serving communities that had been largely excluded from adequate medical care. His experience as Washington's squad medic had shown him that knowledge and skill were more important than social prejudice in determining who could save lives and serve others. Each member of Washington's squad carried forward the lessons they had learned about the relationship between faith, courage, and practical action. Their post-war achievements in various fields provided evidence that the confidence and competence Washington had helped them develop extended far beyond military applications. Washington himself returned to Alabama after the war and became a minister, serving communities throughout the rural South during the Civil Rights era. His sermons frequently drew upon his military experience to illustrate how faith could provide strength for confronting injustice and working for social change. "I learned during the war that prayer isn't about asking God to do your work for you," he would tell his congregations. "It's about asking for the strength and wisdom to do the work that needs doing. When we face injustice, we pray for courage. When we face opposition, we pray for perseverance. When we face hatred, we pray for the love that can overcome it." Washington's influence on military policy extended well beyond his personal service record. The tactical innovations he had developed for small unit operations in complex terrain became standard elements of infantry training throughout the American military. His methods of maintaining unit cohesion under stress influenced leadership development programs for decades after the war. More significantly, his example of successful racial integration provided evidence that diversity could enhance rather than compromise military effectiveness. The gradual integration of American military forces that began in the late 1940s drew heavily upon the experiences of units like Washington's Squad, where soldiers of different backgrounds had learned to work together effectively. The broader impact of Washington's service extended to changing American perceptions of African American capabilities and character. War correspondents who had covered his unit's achievements provided the American public with examples of black soldiers who demonstrated intelligence, courage, and moral leadership rather than conforming to racist stereotypes. These positive portrayals contributed to the gradual erosion of assumptions about racial inferiority that had justified discriminatory policies in both military and civilian contexts. While progress was slow and often met with violent resistance, the foundation had been established for the civil rights advances that would transform American society in the decades following the war. Washington's understanding of the relationship between faith and action provided a philosophical framework that influenced the civil rights movement's emphasis on nonviolent resistance and moral persuasion. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. drew upon similar traditions that combined religious conviction with practical struggle for social justice. The prayer routine that had initially been mocked by Washington's squad members became a model for how spiritual practices could provide strength for confronting systemic injustice. The idea that faith could enhance rather than replace practical action offered a way of approaching social change that maintained hope while acknowledging the reality of opposition and setbacks. Washington's legacy in military circles continued to influence policy and training long after his retirement from active service. His techniques for small unit leadership were studied at military academies, while his example of moral courage under pressure became part of the curriculum for officer training programs. The integration of American military forces that accelerated during the Korean War drew extensively upon the experiences of units like Washington's Squad, where racial diversity had proven to enhance rather than compromise combat effectiveness. The success of these integrated units provided evidence that segregation had been a policy of prejudice rather than military necessity. By the time Washington retired from active military service in 1965, after serving in Korea and as a training instructor in the United States, his influence had extended far beyond his personal service record. Thousands of soldiers had been trained using methods he had developed, while his example of combining faith with practical action had influenced military chaplain programs throughout the armed forces. Washington died in 1985 at his home in Alabama, surrounded by family members who included children and grandchildren pursuing careers that would have been impossible for African Americans of his generation. His funeral was attended by dozens of veterans who had served under his leadership, as well as civil rights leaders who recognized his contribution to the struggle for equality and justice. The eulogies delivered at Washington's funeral emphasized how his example had demonstrated that true strength came from the combination of faith, courage, and practical competence. His life had proven that spiritual conviction could enhance rather than compromise effectiveness in pursuing justice and serving others. The memorial service included readings from letters that Washington's former squad members had written describing how his leadership had changed their lives and influenced their subsequent achievements. These testimonials provided evidence of how one man's faith and courage had multiplied throughout the lives of those he had influenced. Sergeant Washington taught us that being a good soldier and being a good Christian were the same thing, one veteran observed during the service. Both required courage, discipline, and concern for others. Both demanded that you do your duty regardless of the personal cost. Both meant standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. The impact of Washington's example continued to influence American military and civilian culture long after his death. Military historians studying World War II increasingly recognized the contributions of African American units that had been largely ignored in earlier accounts of the conflict. Washington's tactical innovations and leadership methods became subjects of serious academic study. Civil rights historians similarly recognized Washington's service as an important element in the development of African American confidence and organizing capability that made the civil rights movement possible. His demonstration that black soldiers could perform effectively in leadership roles under extreme pressure provided evidence that contradicted racist assumptions about African American capabilities. The integration of American society that accelerated during the civil rights era was built upon foundations that included the military service of soldiers like Washington and his squad. Their achievements had proven that diversity was a source of strength rather than weakness, and that character was determined by individual commitment rather than racial identity. Religious communities also drew lessons from Washington's example of how faith could provide practical strength for confronting injustice and serving others. His integration of prayer with action offered a model for how spiritual conviction could enhance rather than replace engagement with worldly challenges. The prayer that Washington had offered under fire in that Norman field in June 1944 had been answered not through miraculous intervention, but through the clarity of thought and strength of purpose that enabled him to find solutions where others saw only problems. His faith had provided the foundation for tactical competence, moral courage, and inspirational leadership that had saved not only his squad but had influenced thousands of other soldiers throughout his career. The laughter that had initially greeted Washington's prayer routine had been replaced by respect and admiration, as his squad members discovered that his spiritual practices enhanced rather than compromised his effectiveness as a military leader. Their own transformation from skeptics to believers reflected the broader change in American attitudes toward the relationship between faith and practical competence. The legacy of Washington's service extended far beyond the immediate military context in which it occurred. His example demonstrated that individuals could maintain their moral principles while serving effectively in institutions that often compromise those principles. His success proved that character and competence were more important than conformity to prevailing prejudices. The young man who had knelt in prayer behind a Norman hedgerow had trusted that clarity and courage would come from surrendering his fears to something greater than himself. The wisdom he had gained through that trust had enabled him to save his squad, influence military policy, and contribute to social change that transformed American society. His squad had walked away alive from that field in Normandy, not because of miraculous intervention, but because Washington's faith had provided the calm confidence needed to think clearly under pressure, to make sound tactical decisions when others were paralyzed by fear, and to maintain hope when circumstances appeared hopeless. The prayer under fire had revealed that true strength came not from individual capability, but from trust in principles and purposes greater than personal survival. Washington's willingness to surrender his fears had opened his mind to solutions that fear would have hidden, enabling him to protect his men while advancing the cause of justice and equality that gave meaning to their sacrifice. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.